Good morning. I'm Maureen Scott, the Events and Activities Coordinator for the Learning Resource Center South, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's webinar entitled Mental Health Awareness, Attending to the Social Emotional Development of All Students with Dr. Kara Aiva. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Learning Resource Center South at Rowan University, a partnership with the New Jersey Department of Education, Office of Special Education. We are proud to be a part of the Learning Resource Centers network, which includes 3 centers in New Jersey: South, Central, and North. The Learning Resource Centers fosters achievement of all students with disabilities, their families, and the educational professionals who work with them as they pursue the goal of increasing opportunities and improving educational outcomes in special education. Please check the chat box for links to the LRC-South's website, as well as links to the Learning Resource Center network to find a center near you. To get started, I'd like to go over the way we have our webinar set up today. The presentation is being recorded and all attendees will be sent a link to view the recorded presentation. Closed captioning will be available on the recorded version. As webinar attendees, you are in listen and view only mode. This means your audio is muted and your image will not show. We do want to hear from you though, and we will be using both the chat and the Q&A features. The chat feature is enabled for use by all, and we will be sharing links out via the chat box. Please make sure your chat is set to all panelists and attendees, and be aware that everyone will be able to see what you put in your chat. Please submit questions through the Q&A feature. Our presenter plans to address the questions periodically as we move through the presentation, so please send your questions in as you think of them. There will also be a Q&A session with the presenter at the end of the presentation. Your feedback is very valuable to us, so we ask that you please complete the survey at the end of the webinar. Your input lets us know how we are doing and guides our future plans. You'll need to complete the survey in order to receive a certificate of completion. Please allow us 3 business days from completion of the survey for the certificate to be emailed to you. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Our presenter is Dr. Kara Aiva. Dr. Aiva is an associate professor in the Counseling and Educational Settings program in the College of Education at Rowan University. In addition to her current position in counselor education, her educational career spans over 20 years as a former Spanish teacher and professional school counselor. Please check in the chat box for a link to Dr. Kara Aiva's bio. And now I'd like to welcome Dr. Kara Aiva.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on this gorgeous but what will be hot day today. And I am glad you're here on this kind of important topic. So today we are going to talk a little bit about mental health awareness, which I would have previously shared prior to the pandemic, and then what that looks like after the pandemic, and then what we can do when we return to school in any form or fashion of what that looks like. But what I will say to you is this is a lot. And it could be overwhelming, just the topic in and of itself, plus in the multiple pandemics that we're living. And so what I'm going to say is I'm going to teach, I'm going to answer questions. I will also show you in the PowerPoint where links are for other things for you to be able to further your journey in learning on that process. And that we have a mix of people here today, from educators to special ed consultants to parents. And so I'm going to target education as a whole, but then also have specific links for people to do certain things. And what I'm going to say is that the topic in and of itself is overwhelming. And so just take in what you can. If you miss anything, it is recorded, and I invite you to come back to be able to do that. So one of the things I start with every PD is the assumptions I have about people who are in the audience. And one of them is that we're here because we care, and we care for all students and children. The other is that self-care is really critical to the work that we do, and I will spend some time talking a little bit about that, but that wellness keeps us healthy and able to support students, and that educare, that you're here for continuous professional development. And when I originally created this 2 years ago, I probably didn't anticipate the challenges of changing times for all students to be what it is today, but here we are. So just a little bit about who I am. One of the things I'm going to ask everyone to do when you return back to school is to build relationships with your students, and to keep in mind that this is the longest time period that students have been off from school and out of a routine and to intermixing. And so the question becomes, are they ready to learn? So in the same breath of building relationship, just to give you a little bit about who I am, I am a former Spanish teacher, administrator, and counselor. I've taught undergrad and graduate. I'm also a director of a pre-college program for 10 years. And I also happen to be a parent who identifies as LGBT. And I have 2 children, both who are diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder, and one of my children who is on the spectrum. And I specialize also in group counseling and social skills on some level, and creating neurodiverse environments. And the reason I'm saying this to you is because I have multiple lenses by which I look at this. In addition to during this pandemic, I also supervise school counselors in the state. And so I had a wide-eyed view to what was happening in all of these different districts, and at the same time was working with districts and consulting with them. And so the information is part of my specialty for professionally, part of it is personal, and part of it is really developmental over time, all of these experiences. One of the things I love about my job is that I am able to go into multiple school districts and see what other people do. So I'm just gonna have you ask yourself this question to yourself. If you were back in school face-to-face, are you prepared to address the social emotional needs of your students if another pandemic hit or in transition? Or if you were also face-to-face, if the Black Lives Matter movement was occurring while in session, would you or your school be able to address this? And part of those 2 questions really are about some of the information I'm going to share that we probably should have had some layer and level of knowledge, not you per se, but in education, that we didn't necessarily have, right? And so this is a piece and topic that as we move forward, people are going to have to adjust to be able to learn a little bit more about. But more importantly, in the state of New Jersey, we did pass a year ago in our schools that all of our students would have to have mental health literacy. So we didn't say teachers had to have it, but we are having students, right, get this through phys ed and PE. So today we're going to talk a little bit about mental health. I'm going to give you a rationale and overview of some of the trauma-informed practices, and then what really schools and classes would look like as far as communication and specific interventions. And some of that is actually basic counseling skills too, that teachers will now need, and even parents, and when we're talking to students. So I just want to put a shout out here that we know we have no idea what's happening for schools. We've learned multiple models, most of it being kind of hybrid versions for right now, but they're going to do everything they can to get students into schools in our local area. But we also know there's multiple challenges, right? And they're not challenges that are new to us. They're actually challenges that are exacerbated. So the financial constraints is one of them, especially due to safety and programming. Our mental health stats are up like through the roof, and I'll talk about those. We have almost everyone experiencing some layer and level of trauma, and then obviously the logistics and longstanding issues. If you don't know and are not familiar, there's a coalition who sends to the governor every week questions, and there's a link in here to all of these questions that they want answered from the state in order to come back to school. So I thought this was funny, so I threw this in here about us waiting to figuring out what's going to happen. And so since this is a lot that we're going to dive into, I just want to give this reminder to you for self-compassion for yourself and to really be kind to yourself, particularly during the summer break of what we call for school, although some of you have EYE programs running right now. To not really compare yourself to others. Everyone's in a really different context right now. And I can't stress this enough that self-care is super critical right now. I imagine that all of you had different unique experiences during the last 3 or 4 months, and so did all of our children. And so in order for us to be able to really be there, our self-care is really important. Also to continuously be able to do what you reasonably can do to maintain work-life balance. It is not lost on us that we are asked to do more with less. This is something we've been facing in education for years, but the stakes are higher at this particular point in time. And so remember, you're enough, and to be safe and to be healthy. If I had asked you previously, what are you seeing kids with? Here's what I would typically get. Students have a hard time socializing. This is pre-pandemic. Emotional regulation, boundaries, attention, focus, impulse control are typically a lot of what I was seeing. And there's a rationale and a reason for that. We're quick, right, in the medical and educational field to diagnose, but there are specific reasons why we're seeing that. So just so you know, prior to the pandemic, suicide had jumped from number 3 to number 2 to be the leading cause between 10 to 24-year-olds. And it has actually tripled in the past decade for that particular age group. And then it's increased 76% for older teenagers. And I want to be clear again that this is pre-pandemic because this looks very different right now. And 1 in 5 children, and it had dropped to 1 in 4 children, have a mental health diagnosis. And what is unique about this, or what I want to draw your attention to, is that's actually 1 in 5 that's diagnosed. And so that means that the people that are diagnosed 1 in 5 have access to mental health and or medical care. We do know that those who fall in the LGBTQ plus spectrum are 6 times more likely to experience symptoms of depression. Also, homeless has increased 6 times, and that was pre-pandemic, so we don't even know what final tolls will take for the next 10 years just based on this financial constraint. And I want to talk about autism specifically. We in the state of New Jersey are 1 in 32 children. The national average is 1 in 64, and there are multiple rationale and reasons for that. But the reason I'm also adding this is that they are 83% more likely to have a comorbid diagnosis related to mental health, which is typically anxiety and depression, along many other factors. And so I say this because if we were a traditional face-to-face brick and mortar, and you looked into your classroom of, let's just say 20 students, 4 students in that class would actually not be diagnosed with something or the potential to be diagnosed. And one of the things that we have done for years is target those 4 students, right? And try to differentiate for everyone else instead of trying to teach to the mass in that classroom and those 4 people, instead of teaching to those 4 people. And that's important because these are pre-pandemic statistics, right? Not what's now happening, which we'll go into. Really quickly, here's what had been happening. And just to put this in perspective of where we are in mental health, and we called it a pandemic before going into the COVID pandemic. So we were in what we call the mental health crisis before we were moving into these stages. And I say that with heavy weight because it was an emergency prior, and now it's even more of a factor. So in kids coming to school, there's many things that contextually that happen. So when they arrive, they have had or have not had some sort of preparation that we'll talk about, some sort of diagnosis, trauma, and or label. They each already had personality skills, coping skills, and emotions. So we're talking pre-K and kindergarten, and then some layer and level of intersecting identities. So we know in the state of New Jersey, we've been moving more and more towards preschool and full day kindergarten. And that there were grants available, but it still doesn't change the fact that it's not everywhere. So depending on whether or not students had early intervention, whether they went to daycare, whether they went to preschool or kindergarten full-time or half-time, family expectations, resources that they've had at home, right? Exposure, modeling, communication, and managing emotions, right? We know that when students come to school, coming off that, bus or whatever to preschool or kindergarten, we know that we have what we call this hodgepodge mix. And if you think about where we are when we come back in, that's actually going to be the same for every student. This is no longer like when people first start school. The other aspect is intersecting identities that also kind of shape development over time, and things that we didn't necessarily pay attention to in education specifically either. And so it becomes another layer. And then diagnoses, right? We have students who walk in already with a mental health diagnosis or a physical diagnosis or neurological. And I want to talk to the neurological piece for a moment. There are many neurological disorders, and I don't like the word disorder, just so you know. But ADD and autism are both considered neurological, just like Tourette's. The difference being is autism gets a medical diagnosis, which gets a lot more services. ADHD specifically does not. And so it's always been one of those things where in schools, we've been trying to attend to accommodate, but doesn't also get the same outside services from an insurance perspective if people are fortunate to have that. We have a list of invisible disabilities that I'll go over. One of them actually being just allergies, which is a really scary thing that also causes anxiety. We have students who have experienced all forms of trauma, and I am going to spend some time today talking about adverse childhood experiences. So this is how they're coming to school with a range of all of these emotions, right? Excited, they're anxious, some don't want to go, some are embarrassed and shame, some are insecure, and here we go. We put them in school and say, rip off that Band-Aid, you got to go. I also think we could do that a little better given the anxiety diagnoses that are increasing at the 3 and 4-year-old range. But in general, here's what they're coming with. And then they arrive. And here's what students and you as teachers and educators are up against, right? You're now up against a school system that, depending on where they are, has certain resources, certain policies, certain structural leadership, and then numerous isms that occur, and I will explain. So from a policy perspective, and actually COVID is a reminder of this. So for a long time, we couldn't get students who had severe mental health conditions and or physical conditions on homebound, right? Or homebound instruction. Those of you in this room know how hard that is to get there. And then all of a sudden we're at remote learning, right? So there's no way of being able to go back to not also provide these opportunities. But there are certain academic policies and attendance policies that would really be harmful for students who had any layer and level of a diagnosis, right? There's also how funding works, and then even safety policies that kind of occur. And so depending on how schools are governed also can shape, right, how people experience school and development, and then also mental health. And then we have these isms. And the only thing I'm going to say this right now, we're in the height of this. And so this is not something to be ignored, but I've been giving workshops for years, and I have done exercises with principals and superintendents, and I have asked, give me examples of where this occurs in your school. And no one has ever not been able to name at least 5 times for each one of these categories. So there's no denying that this actually is not existing in schools, but it ultimately is truly affecting the mental health of our students. And then to add more layers, right, for students, we have this instant kind of feedback from social media. Some of you understand that back in the day that if you didn't get invited to a party, you didn't really know about it till the following Monday, right? They know it and live through it moment by moment. So there are social pressures. There's this academic pressure that we put in general on all students about academics being everything, right? And then there are no boundaries, so it's a continuous cycle. And then I am going to talk about there are some discipline and teacher practices that are also can cause some form of emotional trauma and emotional abuse, which then leads also to the stigma that we have about mental health. And so even if I'm feeling this particular way, and even as an adult, I also don't seek help because it's also shameful, and we see the mental health as this stigma. And one of the things that also contributes to all of those things that I've just talked about is this idea that people are in homes, and then they go to school, and then they interact with the community. And everywhere they go is a set of rules and ways in which they're interacting in the world, and none of them are the same, right? And so we leave students and children to try and figure out how to navigate and to maneuver in all of these places and spaces. And right, so the place that they spend the most amount of time is a place that can regulate some of that. And for a long time, we've been in this debate about, do we have this happen at home? Do we have this happen at school? And the reality is, up until COVID, right, we spent most of the time during the week in a school setting. And so we are conditioned to operate in this one particular way based on where school is. And so the pressure of having to work through multiple environments, even if you had a layer and level of what I'll call stress or worry, then amplifies by not knowing how to interact in each one of those spaces, which turns into this, what I'll call triple threat for students that causes a lot of concern. And as a result of that, we have students who then internalize. So there's a difference, right, that when we'll talk about behavior, between behavior that's exerted and then those who really we don't intervene with because they're quiet, and we think because they're quiet and they're doing their work that nothing's wrong. And those also are students that we really should be focusing on, that we haven't for a long period of time. And so what you see now is this increase of anxiety. We have an increase in autism. We have an increase in ADHD. We have an increase in depression. And as a result, we have limited social skills and limited and a decrease really in executive functioning, which I am going to explain in detail, because all of this affects the ability for students to be able to learn and just to even take in some information. And so when we talk about mental health, right, we're so quick to talk about physical health. We don't feel well, we go see a doctor, we maybe get some assistance in that process, we feel good, we continue moving on. But mental health works in the exact same way, where it's on a continuum, right? Just like physical health, and that we need to start continuously actively addressing it, and to be able to, it's kind of like cardio fitness, right? We do exercise physically so that we can keep good heart, our bodies can be in good shape. And so the rationale for all the things that you see for meditation and mindfulness is really about giving your brain this space and break to increase your mental health. So the brain in general has these functions, right? It oversees our thinking and cognition, our sensing and perception, our emotions and how we feel. It also signals like in response to the environment. So this is where kind of our flight or fight come from. There's also, it controls the physical or somatic aspect of our bodies, and then our behavior. And so you can see that there are what I'll call diagnoses that affect each one of those things. And those diagnoses is what we've always called as mental health disorders. And so for an example, something that affects thinking and cognition, right, is really a psychotic aspect for us. And so an example we would give is schizophrenia, or even going into psychosis. A disorder that affects emotions or feelings are what we call mood disorders, depression, anxiety. Signaling is really where all of our anxieties are about how to adapt in those environments, the constant worry. So one example, because I'm going to go into specifics about anxiety disorders, is panic disorder. And then as you can see from a physical perspective, substance abuse and behavior, as we see from an impulse aspect, right, ADHD. And so I say this to say that all of these are no different than getting a diagnosis like having a cold, having a flu, but we don't see it that way because mental health has this major stigma attached to it. So what I'm going to tell you is clear up some myths that we see all the time. It is not a consequence of bad parenting, although I can admit I have seen teachers actually say this. It's not the result of a personal weakness or deficit, because we start to question ourselves when we don't feel what we call right in our head. It's not the result of bad consequences. And there was a time period where we really believed that this was a spiritual aspect, and that it could be related on some form to the devil. And it is not caused by poverty. It's also not caused by a nutritional diet, but there are certain instances and deficiencies that could cause the brain to have some sort of mental health. So I don't want to rule that out completely. But everyone has mental health and needs to be cared for. And because it controls all of these major events in our lives and how we experience the world, we kind of need to start exercising our mental health. And that's why you start to hear a lot more about those things happening in schools, mindfulness and meditation. It also is a stigma. There's a stigma attached to it. And so because of the stigma, there are barriers to people seeking help, right? And so we, as I previously mentioned, New Jersey is one of the few states that have started to require mental health literacy. And part of that is to dispel the stigma and for everyone to recognize symptoms in themselves. And that stigma has really been impacted by COVID and the Black Lives Matter. As previously mentioned, I was overseeing multiple counselors in multiple school districts across the state. And so I can see the disparities that happen both from an educational perspective, from a food perspective, from a medical perspective, and from a mental health perspective. And I'm going to be honest, it doesn't look good. And so, which is why I imagine all of you are here. I looked at what you wanted to get out of this presentation, and I attempted to fit it all in here, because we are really at an interesting place and point in time. Like, more than ever, ending that stigma is really important, because everyone is somewhere on the continuum of mental health. And there are a lot more people over what I'll call that middle line, into a whole nother category, which had COVID not happen, and had the Black Lives Matter not start moving in this direction, we actually wouldn't even be able to attend to some of that had been happening for so long. And so on some level, there's a plus, and on some levels, we have a lot more people who have a rise in what I'll call diagnoses. But I do want to, it's really important to mention that it is really, everyone can receive support or treatment and live an effective life, right, from a day-to-day perspective. There are certain diagnoses that make it a little harder, but it doesn't change the fact that mental health, even with a diagnosis and support and treatment, can have a full functioning life, carry a job. Those are all things that can happen, have relationships. But there's also consequences to not getting help that could keep people from being able to live effectively every day. So I'm going to play only a couple minutes of this video. I should tell you I have numerous videos in here. Some I'm going to play, and some I'm going to just say that they're there so you can kind of go back and watch when you get the slides. But this is really truly about kind of the evolution of the stigma. Oh, and maybe I didn't enable macros, and so I'm just going to keep on moving. Yep, sure didn't. So I want to talk about the two major mental health aspects that you are seeing in schools. And so I mentioned there are a lot of students who have comorbid diagnosis, and chances are it is something else and some form of anxiety disorder. And anxiety disorders are on the rise. They are the number one climbing diagnosis in the mental health field. And it really is about how we react to stress. And I want to be clear that it's one thing to have stress. It's another to have what we call toxic stress. And toxic stress can lead to anxiety. And I'm going to say this because it's never been more important than ever before. But if we don't intervene for anxiety by third grade, then the chances of having mental health and eventually depression becomes a lot greater, like in the 80% range. And so I'm saying this is how important early intervention is in mental health. We do it for academically and we do it behaviorally, but we've never really looked at the behaviors to realize that those behaviors are actually associated to mental health, and we need to intervene with kindness and support and not necessarily discipline. And this has been a cycle we've been in education for a long period of time, that we weren't making the connections to realize that those behaviors are actually associated with the mental health diagnosis. And so, and how people get a diagnosis, just so you know, using the diagnostic, is that it has to interfere with their daily living. And so we have separation anxiety, and I know all of you who work in early childhood and elementary see this, particularly in the first couple weeks of school. Separation anxiety is huge, it's on the rise. And there are a lot of reasons. We have, and you'll see this when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, we have epigenetics and cycles, a generation of anxiety. And so by the time we get students who are coming into school, they've been living in a household potentially with parents who are also anxious. And that is genetic, they are genetically predisposed and then obviously environmentally predisposed. And so when they come to you, there is a huge aspect of separation anxiety. And you all know this. This isn't something where we just say, hey, let's go to school for an hour today, right? Let's go to school for 2 with mom or dad or guardian, right? Or then let's do 2 hours and work ourselves up. We don't do that. We just say, hey, here's your classroom. You're going into kindergarten or preschool, and then, oh, gotta go, and we're out of there. And so you can imagine that that literally scars kids in education and anxiety for the rest of their lives, right? General anxiety disorder itself is probably the number one diagnosed, because obviously the name generalized. And some of you might even on here, this call, be diagnosed with general anxiety disorder. I have 2 children that are diagnosed with this. And it is a constant worry that you can't get out of your head, right? There's constantly thinking or needing to overplan and all of those things associated with it, because you can't get rid of that anxiety. But we also know anxiety has physical symptoms, right? And that we're going to talk about. But part of that is, you know, deep, fast breath, increased heart rate, trouble sleeping, not being able to eat. All of those are associated with generalized anxiety. Panic disorder, and I have a link to a video that will be on here as well, is really one where people end up having panic attacks. And you yourself might have had one before. And this is something, and part of the rationale for explaining mental health literacy is our students don't know that their bodies are connected to their feelings, and they actually don't even know feeling words that are associated with it. So it's really hard for kids to tell us that they are experiencing anxiety. And I'm going to use this story that I tell. I teach graduate level students who are coming back in for counseling, and we have a huge wellness component to our entire program. And during an interview, I asked a particular student, you know, about wellness, how will you handle this? And she said, she was, as a college athlete, she was talking to her mom on the phone, and she was explaining what was happening to her. And her mom said, "You're having a panic attack." And she's like, no, I'm not. My friends and I, this happens to my friends and I all the time. And that's at a place where we are, like, people think it's normalized to have that much anxiety, and specifically panic attacks, and having multiple of them means that there's an underlying mental health condition to kind of address. Specific phobias we have. Social anxiety has been on the rise. So I say this to say that there are a lot of students who are thriving by not going to school. Whereas if they were in school, they wouldn't be performing as well as they probably have been doing remote learning. And a lot of that has to do with their entire anxiety piece has been removed from them. And so doing academics, right, is one of those things that is now easier for them. And I want you to think about that, right? For this particular subgroup, their entire stress and anxiety was removed from them. And so when it's removed from them, they're able to learn. And so we need to start thinking about that for all kids. What is it that's going to get them to be able to learn? And there are lots of things that have to be addressed prior to that happening. Lately, I've also seen a rise in a select mutism. For those of you who don't know, this is based on an anxiety disorder, but people tend to be mute. Sometimes they're mute in schools. Sometimes they're mute in specific environments. Sometimes they only speak to a parent or one caring adult. And schools are having a hard time navigating really how to accommodate students with select mutism. But it can be based on trauma, and it can be based on anxiety. But the diagnosis of select mutism, so those who have access to mental health care, has actually been on the rise. Obsessive compulsive disorder, some of you on here are probably active, what I say, cleaners and organizers and lists. That doesn't mean that we have OCD. Like, we joke about this, but it doesn't. Obsessive compulsive disorder is really truly about something that interferes on a daily life that you wouldn't actually be able to function, right, without support. And then everyone on some level right now is experiencing what we call PTSD on varying levels, and not necessarily diagnosable. But what we do know from research is that teachers and who work in schools, or anybody who works in schools, also sometimes has what we call vicarious trauma. By being or taking on what is happening for students, or what is happening to other people, or even what's happening in your family. And so if you think about this from a wide range, from a global perspective, everyone on some level is taking in, if not their selves, but somebody else's trauma. Moving forward, just so you know that this is a video of a virtual panic attack. I wasn't also going to show it today, and part of the rationale behind that is that I don't want this to trigger for anybody right now. And so I'm not showing this video, but I want you to know it's there. And when I give videos or show videos, part of the rationale is choosing it is that you're also able to show it and use it with students and or parents and or community members who you might be training. And so this is one that really does kind of give every detail of what it's like. And for those of you in special ed, and there are a lot of you here, it also kind of mirrors the sensory piece that our students feel who have sensory issues, and that not everyone's truly been able to grasp. And so this is a kind of a good video to be able to explain that. And then there's depression. So I want to mention that the rise of what I'll call social isolation right now is just one aspect, has really increased the layering and label of depression right now while we are sitting here in this pandemic. And so some of you will notice some of these signs that you see, right? Angry outbursts, which is really uncommon for certain people, weight loss, weight gain, withdrawing from friends, and not participating in things that they used to particularly like. And those are signs, particularly for you as teachers, as frontline individuals, that something's a little off. Now, the hard part is we're coming back after COVID, and we're going to talk about some of those interventions, but it's going to look different for you. But it's not part of the rationale for building a relationship, whether we're virtual or whether in person, is we have to actually know our students well enough to know so that we can pick up on also some of these symptoms, because teachers have now really become the front line for triage for students. And so while I train counselors, right, particularly those who work in schools and in higher ed settings, we're the next layer and level of that, but truly teachers are the first layer and level of and parents of being able to refer. Obviously ignoring things. and not doing their work. And we can't use COVID right now as the rationale for avoiding work because it's so compounded with lots of factors, which I'm going to talk about. So that's really hard to recognize right now for you as a teacher. Not caring how they look is another one. But again, we've also been online. Everyone's been in a Zoom or an online format. Is that necessarily a sign? We don't know. So I say that with a caution, a cautionary. And then if you look at all these signs and symptoms, some of you have some of this right now and not understanding why you are seeing some of this, right? So no one's saying that you are completely depressed, but those are signs and symptoms that, hey, maybe I need to do something else to take care of myself. So difficulty sleeping is definitely one. And I can say that myself during this pandemic, sleeping was a little rough for me at first as I got adjusted to this. Obviously changing in diet, both in either direction, a general fatigue. And these are sometimes as women, we feel hormonally every month too. And so you're not sure how to distinguish, is this normal or is this something that could be extra different? Intimacy issues, low motivation, also not enjoying things you once did. I'm not going to lie, as a parent during this time period with 2 kids who have anxiety, what I don't miss is getting everyone up and getting ready and getting on the bus and the pressure that takes to have that happen. And so it's that's completely removed from my ability to be able to function as a parent. And I say that because I can notice the difference in certain things happening. The other thing I notice for myself is that I have difficulty concentrating or remember things. And if I feel like I have difficulty as a result of some of these aspects, then it's very possible that our students are feeling the same way. And you can see some of the other physical aspects that happen with headaches and upset stomachs. And every school nurse will tell you this. They've literally seen, hundreds of students for stomach aches. And truly, yes, we've eaten bad food, and yes, there's a million reasons why we can have upset stomach, but parents who have had their students eventually get diagnosed with anxiety, depression, or have attempted suicide can look back and say, they told me they had an upset stomach numerous times. And I'm saying that it's something that we dismiss. Same thing with headaches. Hey, let's just give them Tylenol, they'll feel better. And I'm not saying that those aren't one-time things, but we don't start to see those as patterns. And I'm saying if we're really looking at early intervening, we need to start looking at some of those physical symptoms, because the physical symptom is really what presents more for any layer and level of a diagnosis. This is also a video about a high school student who talks and describes his depression and what it's like and how hard it is to come to school and learn. Ooh. At some point, I might check that out because there is a couple of videos I really do want to show you. And so from anxiety and depression can look very similar. And so I put this up here just for you to realize that we are not people to diagnose. Right? So I want to be clear about that. We're not people to be able to diagnose, but we are people to look at symptoms and to be able to triage and to be able to get students to be able to get the help that they need. And so I would just wanted to show the overlap between anxiety and depression here, because they are realistically the ones that are typically diagnosed in the students that we potentially have. And for those of you in talking about comorbid diagnoses, these are also the ones that are associated with some of our other neurological disorders. We already talked about this. So prior to COVID, we were in what we call the silent epidemic. Well, not the people in my field, but in general, we weren't really caught on to mental health being a crisis. And then everything changed. So we call this entering 4 pandemics, right? And some of you have seen this meme, right? Like we're all in the same boat, but we are not in the same storm. And I also want to be clear that we're in the middle of these pandemics and that have literally implications for at least 10 years. And so that is ultimately the scary part. But when I'm talking about the 4 pandemics, I am talking about COVID itself. I'm talking about a mental health pandemic. I'm talking about a racial pandemic. And then I'm talking about an economic and a financial pandemic, because all of those things, believe it or not, intersect with one another and truly change the game as far as mental health is concerned. So I go back to say, are our students ready to learn? And the reality is no. And so I'm going to say to all of you right now, if you are in a school who is coming back and we're only focusing on academics right away, then we need to be clear that we are dismissing everything that has happened to students and what will now be almost a 6 to 8 month period by the time they come back to school. And so if we're walking into a building and we're, introducing ourselves for day one and starting school, because of what's happening and the multiple implications it has moving forward, your students are not going to be able to adapt in the same way. And so here are things you hear, right? Our students need routine, right? We talk about this from parenting and early childhood. Yes, they do need routine, right? They need predictability. It's true, because they can't take in any other information. But all of those things don't necessarily say, so I'm going to start teaching reading and math, because they don't even know how to interact with one another. And so I just want to keep your eyes open to the fact that we are working on trying to plan for something we don't know and entering a school building. And you yourself could be affected by any one of these 4 pandemics, right? And so there's a level that you also need to attend to, right? And then that we also need to attend to for children. And so I'm just saying that this is really something that is going to truly shape how we handle education moving forward, even though we are told to do more with less as a result of the financial constraint. But it still doesn't change the fact that everyone's environment has drastically changed and could truly trigger. So for those of you, and there are a lot of you in here who work with special ed children, right? We know that transitions, right, and sudden changes cause a whole lot of behaviors which are really associated with mental health. So we also have to assume that when we come back to any form of schooling, that same thing is also true for them. And so I go back to, sure, we all see what's happening, but none of us have the same dynamic for what's coming and for what's happening in your own personal lives. So here's where students are. Mental health is mediated by protective factors, right? And certain things called coping skills, and really is shaped by their experiences. So we have a slew of students who are actually thriving. Some of those are like our students who have social anxiety, right? Who just like to learn and don't want to deal with everything else. So we have students who are relieved, who are happy, who are really engaged and who are really focused. And some of that is also could be based on the schools that they attend and could also be socioeconomic status. And then we have what I'll call the majority of students who are still stressed, still scared, and still anxious. And they may not share that information. So that also goes from preschoolers to high schoolers who also may not be talking and processing. Because if I go back to saying this to you, students who have generally sat there, kind of done well in school, we really never attended to. And if students don't understand how their bodies and their minds are connected, and they don't have the vocabulary to tell you what those words are because they don't know that it's also associated to their physical aspect, then they're also not processing and telling other people. And we know as adults that when we're not processing, we're internalizing. And when we're internalizing, it actually is causing medical toxic stress for us, right? So we can talk about coping skills and we can talk about resilience, but if we're not processing with kids and building trusting relationships, then we're just having them internalize all of those feelings. And those feelings then lead to what we call faulty thinking and negative self-talk, which leads to low self-concept, low self-esteem, right? And then really not being able to reach their full potential as a result of where those thoughts get stuck. I just put this up here to show you that this is a 5-year-old who is panicked about the virus. And this is how she interprets it to look based on what we show in the media and then what she actually wrote, right? Now, this is someone who's willing and able to express in writing. But what about our students who are nonverbal, right? Or who don't use PECs, right? Or don't have the opportunity because their parents aren't home to share some sort of expressive aspect. And so this is someone, And a parent posted this, that she would not have known that this is how her daughter felt had she not seen this. And this was actually on the door in front of her room. Here's another common worry specifically about COVID, right? So we have the ranges here right now, just so in case you want to know, New Jersey is the safest state in the country, which isn't interesting considering we had the peak. But with that being said, we have two ranges of people. We have people who fall in a continuum. I'm giving up. I can't live my life like this. And so we're all going out. And then we have some people who are still really cautious and only doing what they have to. And then there are people that fall in between. And depending on who they are and where their families are, there's a layer and level of internalizing. I mean, I get asked all the time, every time we actually get into a car, which has only been a handful of times, is the virus over? Is the virus over? And so students are going to constantly have this at the forefront and the back of their mind. And so this is just some other ways to kind of redirect them. We also have seen a shift. So we do have a number of high school teachers on here as well. We've seen a huge shift of what happened in households. So, and really in relation to coping skills. And so we have some students who have new responsibilities at home, who had to take care of older siblings. But we also had this huge shift of students who were essential workers. Some of it was they were already in those positions, right? Grocery stores, pizza shops, takeout, things of that nature. But then we had a whole slew of parents who got laid off, and high school students went in to become essential workers. So to just kind of keep that on the back burner. And then there's stress associated with that, right? Of being what we call an essential worker. We had a lot of social activist-oriented kids and families who either sewed masks, painted rocks, who are protesting, who are avid on social media as a way of coping to what's happening in the world. And I say that because that's an expressive piece, right? They're able to do something, and so it's not sitting internalized. And we had some who were really focused on academics because they could, and we had some who just had nothing to do with academics and wanted to play video games. But we also had students who have no fresh air and did not receive food. And all of you, for the most part, work for districts, so you understand in the beginning, if you were getting food, depending on where you were, you had to go pick it up more than once a week, which then gave you a higher risk of exposure. Then eventually we kind of went to, okay, we're giving for you and the family, and maybe we'll do it once a week. And everyone did this differently. But at the reality is, it for those that needed food, it put them at greater risk in care, and particularly in poorer communities. We also have places and spaces where they couldn't go outside because it is too busy, or they're in more urban city kind of environments. And to not have fresh air also affects the mental health. And then we had families who were essential workers who either didn't come home and separated from their children, which gave a whole nother layer and level of anxiety. And then we have others by no fault of their own, but parents had to go to work, so they had no supervision or structure. And then we have the exposure to unstable homes. I want to be very clear that teachers are the first line of defense, particularly when it comes to DCP&P. And we have a huge increase, believe it or not. So the decrease, obviously, from schools reporting, but we have received a record number from the hospital of referring for domestic and home abuse. And then substance abuse is on the rise. And substance abuse isn't just on the rise for adults, it is on the rise for children. We had some students who went through series of withdrawals as this was happening, and then as a result took higher risks. But substance abuse and physical abuse is skyrocketed, which then also puts a lot of people vulnerable. And I don't want you guys to think that this is a specific classification of people. This literally crosses every boundary and demographic that exists that's on the rise. And then what we found in COVID is that everyone was experiencing a form of loss. And for those of you who have experienced loss before, you do know that it's a long grieving period. And the hard part about what we're in is that we didn't just have something that happened, right? We have something that happens that's continuing to happen. And then, we get layer after layer after layer. I'm sure you've all seen the memes about the murder hornets on top of that. And then we got locusts. And then in our area, we had a bunch of tornadoes that caused damage, right? And so we're in a place and space of loss and trying to work through this process while simultaneously all these other things are happening. So some of the things that people lost immediately that people can really gravitate to is the loss of rites of passage and milestones, right? Like certain graduations or proms or, you know, 8th grade dances, whatever the case may be. But then we had, for all of our students, they had loss of access to friends. And we all know that kids learn by being environments, by playing with others. And it's important, right, as a part of their life as far as socializing is concerned. And so that alone caused a whole lot of layer for a lot of our students. And I don't know if you have all seen this video or how in tune you are on social media, but there's a father who says that he lost his son to COVID, but not in the way you think is kind of the title. But the reality is his kid had received this really large TV, and he had worked really hard for it in school to get it, all pre-pandemic. And by accident, the video control threw out of his hand and it broke, and he freaked out and he was really scared. But eventually, you know, he worked his will back. He was able to get another one, and then the pandemic hit, and the same thing happened. And he just couldn't handle the internalized pressure of everything that was happening and attempted suicide. And he actually completed suicide. And what the father said was, one of the things that he didn't even realize was that little moments like that would have triggered, because he internalized it for so long, and because there was no access to friends and to anything else that would have processed or buffered that. And so I'm saying this to you, that it doesn't matter where students live right now. It does, particularly if we are students of color or if we are living in a low SES perspective. Those amplifications right now and being in survival mode is a constant state that is truly affecting our mental health, which is why schools are safety for some people, right? So we lose so a lot of our students lost access to safety and really structure and routine, comfort. And I'm going to talk about loss of control, right? When all of this is happening and we went on executive orders, right? People just feel like they no longer had control over lots of things. And so they had to just play a waiting game. And I say this because a lot of you are here, we also work with students who are classified with some layer and level under special ed. And one of the things that we've done, and for those of you who do ABA or have ABA practices in your schools, is, you know, we try to give choices, right? So that students feel like they are in control. Those students have regressed so far back that they're going to need as much control as they potentially can, because they've lost every aspect of it. And so ways in which we used to intervene or start off a year doesn't look the same anymore, because we're going to have to build in a trust factor of being able to have a layer and level of control. Obviously, the predictability and structure was gone. And that also depended. So there are variations for how everyone did remote learning. And I have heard things like, you can't talk to students, or you can't be live or have videos in some districts. And then others is you had to be at a certain time and you walk through your class. So there's a wide range, right, with no research to back any of it, of what works for students. But depending on what you got for remote learning, depending on even if there was a structure in that. They did have a loss of being able to see someone else's face. And believe it or not, when you're in person and you're intaking nonverbals and someone's voice and being in a space, it actually can be really soothing and relieving for people. It could also be anxiety producing, but to remove that also is stressful. And then we have what I'll call the tweens. So our 5th graders through high schoolers who lost freedom. And when they lost freedom, they also lost the ability of what we call risk-taking. And risk-taking is actually a developmental kind of milestone. And so this went into 2 different directions. Either they were like, forget it, I don't care, and they took greater risks as teens, which they're doing right now. They're hanging out a lot more outside. Or because it didn't happen, it kind of stunted a social emotional growth for people, which means they also have lost some sort of identity development. Because if you think about our basically 4th grade through high school, a lot of that is learning about who you are, right? And who you are in all these environments and in relation to feedback that you're getting from others. And when we went to remote learning, we pretty much lost all of that. And so we talk about students being behind academically, and that's not really the case. They're actually behind a little more in kind of social emotional maturity. And then I just put this here because you also need to think about your families and what's happening for them. There is an increase of anxiety for the, and I'll share, I'm someone who has two basically underlying conditions that really could be harmful to contracting COVID, right? But there are a lot of people who have invisible disabilities who are their levels of anxiety have totally gone through the roof, of just being afraid of getting it, right? Fear of losing loved ones. And I'm going to tell you that I have had horror stories and have heard horror stories about the loss. And I think that's one of the things that people don't realize until it affects you, about how many students have lost either peers, teachers, family members on a daily basis. And because we're so used to right now so many deaths per day, it almost gets normalized, which isn't necessarily a good thing either, because we also know that how you grieve really early on sets up to how you grieve later on in life. And so if it's not really healthy right now, it ultimately can affect them in the long run, down the line. And so I put this up here to also talk about the financial piece. We have tons of families who are struggling who aren't used to struggling. And so what we're going to see in the next 10 years, just as a fallout from this, is not just the mental health piece, where we're going to see it from the layer and lens of how many families have to change circumstances, districts, where they live, who they live with as a result of the economy. And that's not something we're also then prepared to be able to handle in school as well. And so I put that out there because we also really need to be mindful of everybody's situation. And then talk to two things, then I'm going to ask Maureen for a couple of questions before I move on to that whole other section. But I would be remiss to not talk about racial trauma. And this is something I've been aware of pretty much my entire academic life, as far as the racial disparities that persist in education. And there is no denying that schools have not caused a layer and level of trauma for years. And not just trauma for the students that you have now, but repetitive cycles for years. It does start with classification in special ed, and I'm going to speak to this specifically. We have always overdiagnosed ODD in schools, and have put students in self-contained and never addressed the mental health component. And had we given the support, it could change how students were able to actually be able to reach their full potential in school. We know the stats, they're out there, but our students of color literally have been eliminated from some of the opportunities and access as far as education is concerned, not to mention the racism and discrimination and microaggressions they get from teachers and principals alike on a daily basis. And to just tell you the mental and trauma impact that causes, and I have seen a lot of it in the last 2 months, is really something that has changed really my layer and lens of even what trauma looks like. Because what I'll say is everyone experiences trauma for themselves, but the magnitude of what this is, and then to see the Black Lives Matter movement and to be watching on TV is a whole nother layer and layer of trigger for students. And so if your school districts, and I'm going to say this because I work with school districts, did not set out statements to reaffirm students, that also sent another message to your students and to your teachers and to your faculties of color, which further traumatized. So I'm putting this out there to not say that this is all on you, but it is something that can no longer not be addressed when students return back. And here's kind of the impact of racism on mental health, and getting access then as a result, and also of stigma, also keeps people from being able to get access. We already know the disparities in our communities of color as far as the medical access for COVID, and simultaneously also for mental health. And so you have students who are constantly what I will call on high alert or in trauma, like 24 hours a day. And schools can either re-trigger that and provoke it, or they can be a place of calming and intervening. And for everyone right now, we need it to be that calming place and intervening. So Maureen, I'm just going to stop really quickly to go into now what everyone's experiences as far as trauma is concerned.
Okay, Kara, we had a question about what resources or organizations are available for children who are twice exceptional.
Yeah, okay. So here's the deal. We live in here, and most of you, I looked at this, are somehow affiliated in the South Jersey region. We are actually in what we call a mental health desert. Similar to that, we have some of our cities that actually are like food deserts. We actually have very limited resources for mental health. The good news is that we have increased options as far as telehealth is concerned. And because we've increased the options for telehealth concerns, it's opened the doors. And so we do have students who, and when we say twice exceptional, my assumption is that you mean they're classified in special ed and also mental health, or maybe even a racial component to that too. I don't know. I probably should have clarified that. But what were you going to say, Maureen?
I don't have additional details. That was
Okay.
the question.
Yeah. So I would say that telehealth is now available, and there is actually a lot more free telehealth happening. And that if you have medical insurance, or those students have medical insurance, there's an increase in that. What there's not an increase on, so here's where the desert is despair comes from, is that some of our students who are twice exceptional and are low income, or who may be living off of what I'll call Medicaid, may not have as many options, but it has been covered under telehealth. And so finding the resources are really hard. And one of the things that we're telling communities and school leaders and school counselors right now is to really reassess their resources, because it now has a far-standing reach. So some of the places and spaces that you used to refer to also don't no longer exist, or don't exist in the same way. And so unfortunately, going through a crisis is actually crisis intervention is actually the way to be able to get assistance and help. But also calling DCCMP from a social worker standpoint can also extremely help. So our options are larger, but it doesn't mean they're easier to find, I guess I should say. And so people are struggling right now to try and find what all of those resources are, and all those nonprofits who have opened up the door to be able to do this. They exist, but I just want to be clear, it's really hard to find, and it is county by county. So what we're telling everyone is New Jersey Mental Health has its own hotline. That's something I should actually also make sure, Maureen, that you send out. We just started this probably 3 weeks ago, that any parent or child can talk. And then Ascenda exists now in every county, and Ascenda has its own child crisis line and parent crisis line that you can call 24 hours a day as well. And both of those places can actually then pinpoint you to resources. And so at least we now have a central location for those. Did you mute me?
I'm sorry, I'm trying to mute myself and I muted you by mistake. I apologize.
Well, at any rate, my point is that now those two central places have a little handle of what's happening broader. And then just from a grief and loss perspective, keeping in mind we are very lucky in the state of New Jersey to also have grief, the Traumatic Loss Coalition, that's really supportive and helpful in that process. And so I want to say, that was a long way to answer your question. There are more resources available. The problem is that your twice exceptional child may not also want to be virtual, but the reality is the telehealth options have increased the access, and that's kind of how people are being treated right now. So that's the hard piece I see. And I say that as someone who is a mom to a child on the spectrum who literally can only handle an hour a day on the computer. So to get that support becomes a lot harder. Am I good, Maureen?
Yes, you are good. We had a few other questions, which we've answered in the chat with regard to New Jersey Mental Health Cares.
Yes.
And someone asked us to share out the link to the TED Talk from earlier, so that is also in the chat. And then after we're done, Kara, I'll touch base with you and find out what links or things we can send out. I'll send an email out to all participants when we're done with any additional links from videos.
Yeah, and there are a lot of hyperlinks in here. And when I save the PDF, those links should also be, like the video links are already on them. I will double check, Maureen, just to make sure that when I did the PDF that it was enabled, the content was enabled, and if not, I'll just re-add it again.
Excellent.
Resend it to you. Okay.
Great, thanks. So that's it for questions for now.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I am purposely playing this video for everyone because I am not sure how many of you have been schooled in what I call adverse childhood experiences. And I'm saying this because everyone is having and experiencing like this right now. So based on what they tell you, is really true for what's happening right now. And so it does impact your brain and body. And so, Maureen, just let me know if there is an issue with sound, okay?
A child's experiences early in life are important building blocks for the developing brain. Genes, nature, are like the blueprint. They provide the basic framework for brain development. However, genes do not design the brain completely. Environmental influences, nurture, fine-tune how the brain works by shaping which brain connections get used. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent, whereas ones that do not get much use fade away. Together, genes and the environment build the foundation for all future development. Safe, stable, and nurturing relationships early in life lead to healthy development. But children's brains capture other experiences as well. Stressful events. However, not all stress is bad. Positive stress involves normal childhood experiences, like starting daycare or meeting a new person for the first time. This stress is essential for healthy development because it helps children develop coping skills and confidence. But when stress is frequent, chronic, and uncontrolled, it is toxic to children, especially when they do not have a caregiver to provide support or buffer the stress. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, such as abuse, neglect, exposure to intimate partner violence, parental depression or addiction, and poverty are toxic stressors which could lead to lifelong changes in learning and behavior. ACEs early in development can impact social, emotional, and cognitive functioning, increased risk-taking behavior such as drinking and substance use, and increased risk of disease, disability, and social problems later in life. The question is, how do adverse childhood experiences impact a lifelong development? One of the most important systems in our body is our stress system. It's activated when we experience stress. We become alert, our heart rate increases, and so do our stress hormone levels, cortisol and adrenaline. Our body is ready to react, what is known as fight or flight. A short period of time after the stress is over, or if a child receives support from a caregiver, the stress response turns off and the body returns to a normal state. Adverse childhood experiences create stress responses that stay active, and without the support of a caregiver, the system has difficulty shutting off completely. This constant and prolonged activation can affect immune system functioning and increase the chances of sickness, infection, and disease. Prolonged activation of stress hormones is also toxic to the brain. Certain areas of the brain are more vulnerable to toxic stress, including the executive center or the brain's control center, an area important for solving complex problems, attention, reasoning, impulsivity, inhibition, and learning. A second area is the emotional center, the brain's alarm system, which is involved in processing and interpreting emotions and the ability to control impulses. The third area is the memory and learning center, the brain's filing cabinet, which plays a major role in learning and the formation and retrieval of memories. Science shows that adverse childhood experiences impact all of these brain centers. Behaviorally, what we begin to see is emotional distress, poor emotion regulation, greater impulsivity, learning difficulties, and physical and mental health problems. More recently, science has begun to look at how ACEs cause changes in gene expression through a process called epigenetics, which helps us understand how nature and nurture interact. Epigenetics causes changes in the way genes work without changing the DNA code itself. This occurs through chemical changes influencing how the code is used. In other words, genes are like the hardware in a computer. They determine the boundaries of what is possible. However, we need an operating system to tell the hardware what to do. Epigenetics is like the operating system directing the function of a gene's DNA hardware. The genes we are born with are the genes that we have for life, but experiences like nutrition, exercise, smoking, stressors, and relationships all affect our biology. Adverse childhood experiences are associated with epigenetic changes related to stress, brain development, cognition, and systems associated with mental and physical health. Changes that happen early in brain development are more likely to be enduring and are possibly passed on to future generations as well. The good news is that positive, supportive relationships at any stage in life can make a difference. However, supporting families and children early on will help prevent many of these negative outcomes. One of the key ingredients for healthy development is having warm, loving, and actively engaged caregivers. This involves promoting serve and return interactions, where caregivers actively and warmly engage with the child, making eye contact, responding to sounds, words, gestures, emotional needs, and sharing experiences like reading and play. Providing programs that support caregivers to strengthen these abilities are the blocks that build healthy foundations for life.
Before you get started, we have a question that pertains to the video. That now.
Go ahead.
At what age or developmental age would one be susceptible to adverse childhood experiences? For example, I teach 3 to 5-year-olds who have significant developmental delays.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, so I would also add that teachers are caregivers. And so you, in the nature of being a teacher in a warm, safe environment, which we're going to talk about, has the potential to mitigate some of that. And so, yes, it could also have been epigenetics and genetic could have also, and environment could have also been affected, obviously, by the time they got to you. But what they refer to as serve and return is crucial from 3 to 5 in the age group that you're talking about, but can also be substantial later on in life too, as being able to intervene. But the critical piece from the 3 to 5-year-old perspective is the intervening in that moment of time. And what is going to be really hard in this post-pandemic world and is the ability to be able to interact in the same way that we have been. And so there's a lot of talk about what if we, what if we kept middle school and high schools home, but brought in the elementary and early childhood. And the rationale really is this, right? They need to see, they need to be in environments that are safe and welcoming for them. The hard part about that is that the warming and the trusting aspect allows them to then be able to be ready to be able to receive the academic development that they're already behind, right? And so really a lot should be spent foundationally at this point in time, really on kind of the social environment and that trusting and nurturing environment versus the content of what we're trying to catch them up with. And so the question really is like how early. I mean, that it's critical in that particular time period, but it doesn't mean that someone in high school shouldn't be as hyper focused on that as well, because that also can make the difference for people moving forward as well. And so I say this to say that trauma, there are lots of other trauma inducing experiences. So you saw in this film, they talked about substance abuse and depressive parents and neglect and abuse themselves. And so, yes, that's how we've always understood it. But there are also other aspects that have then caused trauma, prolonged bullying, just social media intake itself can cause it, rejection. And I want to be clear, teachers can also be the one to cause trauma. That also has the exact same effect. And I know that's uncomfortable to hear, but based on teachers and the communications in which they can and how they communicate with students, and based off the control in their classroom and policies, actually can further exacerbate trauma or trigger previous trauma that has already occurred. And so I know that that's hard to hear, but I just want to make sure that you've seen how some teachers talk to kids. And so it can be either further triggering for mental health. I also talked to you earlier about a long list of invisible disabilities and our neurodiverse learners, right? Where it's not something you're necessarily seeing all the time, but it literally causes a severe also amount of trauma. And I said earlier allergies, and the reason I said that is because you can imagine the kid who has a huge allergy getting on a bus, ends up sitting next to someone who's eating something they don't know what it is. So they don't know if they're going to get triggered or not. So they're sweating. They're like, can't wait to get to school. And they walk into their first period class who's ready to have a test, and they just can't function to be able to take the test, and yet we expect that. And so this is just another mindful piece of all the other ways in which trauma can occur for students. And what that really means also is that what's happening right now as far as COVID and also racial trauma is exacerbated right now. And so you might have had kids with certain levels of trauma, but it's highly possible that you might have a large majority of students who have now experienced what we would call an adverse childhood experience based on what's happening in their homes and experiencing COVID. And that doesn't mean that they can't be from what I will call an upper class, wealthy white family and not have experienced trauma, because they can. And so I'm saying that there are vulnerable populations, but because of what's happening globally, there are a lot more people experiencing trauma on a global level than we've ever seen before. And so what we don't know is, and if ACEs has the ability to have long-standing, the only reason we actually know about ACEs is because of the adults and the long-standing health issues that they have as a result of internalized trauma. And so we know what's happening now could literally have 10 to 15 years of effects and can literally affect this entire generation if we don't mediate and intervene. And that is what we do know. The problem is that everyone in their own silos as businesses and education, all those things, are trying to figure out how to move forward, but not attending to the fact that we are dealing with what we call a really global mental health pandemic simultaneously. I'm going to skip how all teachers calls trauma, just because for the lack of time. But I did want to add here that they actually revamped the ACEs model in the video that you saw, specifically when it comes to microaggressions and implicit bias for marginalized populations, specifically race and our brown and Black children and families. But it can also be to some other marginalized group like women and LGBT. And you can see it's even further deep-seated, and that it causes even more physical and mental health coming down the pike. I'm going to go over these really quickly on the impact of it. You heard most of this. Emotions, if in the beginning, if I had asked what you've seen, right, we talked about emotional regulation or impulse control. This is truly how it does affect them. They internalizing it in low self-esteem and low self-concept. And it's not uncommon, and I would just want to say this out loud, it's not uncommon for someone to have such toxic stress and internalize that it just kind of sits in their stomach, and then to end up later on with some physical ailment that is related to the stomach. So to really recognize the physical and emotional and mental piece kind of go together. We know it affects mental health, so I'm not going to go there. But relationships, and I don't think everybody's ever learned and looked at it this particular way. Our brains are wired for connection, right? But our trauma rewires them for protection, right? So like flight or fight happens in this moment. And so what happens is our ability to build healthy relationships with adults, with children, with anyone, also then keeps us from being able to have intimate relationships. And so we see a long-standing change in how people are in relationships. And a lot of that is the brain wiring in relation to some sort of layer and level of trauma. We already know the academic piece because that's what you actually see. But, not being able to focus is a huge piece of that. I am going to talk specifically about executive functioning skills. Behavior, right, is another piece that we see. Again, we in schools have disciplined for a long period of time based on it. And I'm cautioning all of you in your environments or help you advocate that punishing right now is not the way to go, right? Educating and processing what's happening is a very different aspect than to how that behavior is working. Because we used to think that school classrooms had to be quiet and all of those kinds of things in order to make that people were learning. And the reality is that's not actually how people learn anymore. And ask yourself this, like, how many times do you put on a movie and not pick up your phone, right? Like, you literally are constantly on and wired. And I say this because before the pandemic, everyone was called on a wired brain, which is also really a trauma brain, like you're on high alert. And we were doing that based on all the technology we had already had. And so if you take that and then you throw on the pandemics on top of it, now we've totally increased that further for everyone. I do want to recognize that there are different ways to handle trauma. And the reason I just put this up for you is, you know, to look at obviously and recognize some symptoms and to respond. The difference is your response and everyone else in your environment's response, you need to make sure doesn't re-traumatize kids. And that is a different way and layer of thinking about how we're going to educate students moving forward, whether that is virtually or whether that's in person. I'm going to talk about a little specifically about those. Behaviors that we've seen, you have all on here seen this. I already talked about the physical symptoms. I've already talked about the need for control. We do see a lot of students who can't focus. You all know this, that we can't get students to focus for more, at the younger ages, for more than really 5 minutes, maybe 7 minutes at a clip, and that's pushing it for some. And so we have to change what we do as a result, right? Defiance and misbehavior, again, the refusing to comply, we always punished and not really looking at the fact that it was mental health. Anger and frustration. Well, anger and frustration are constant, is really the outburst of having constant trauma and constant stress, right? So again, we don't necessarily typically attend to it, we punish. Sleep issues obviously is one. Avoidance is another. Some of you on this call probably have numerous runners in your schools, is what people call them. And part of that is avoidance is twofold. Some of it is sensory, but some of it really is mental health. And so we need to figure out how to meet in the middle for that to be able to happen. And then seeking validation and excessive question asking, I want to talk to. Seeking validation really speaks to, I have low self-esteem and I have, I'm kind of insecure, but I need that validation in order to continue to do tasks that you want me to do. I teach a few students on the spectrum at the higher ed level where I get emails weekly, here are my assignments, and I need to write back, you're good to go, because I know that fixation and rumination will happen. And all of that is associated with anxiety. Same thing with excessive question. A lot of you have a hard time with the child who constantly raises their hand to ask questions. But that asking questions isn't because I want to show off to know all these informations. It's truly, I can't continue moving forward. And particularly some of your OCD students. I've sat in examples of when we used to do old school spelling tests and people used to have to write the words down. Well, if the word isn't perfect, right, I'm never listening to the rest of the words that you're saying because I'm too focused on making sure that that first word is written perfectly. And so ways in which we need to validate kids now has to change for the masses as opposed to individuals. And the other thing I will attend to here is chandeliering. There's a lot of times that you see kids who you would have never thought go from 0 to 60, right? And just fly off the handle. And that just means we have been dealing with anxiety, toxic stress, and or trauma for so long, there's no other way to cope than to have that happen. And so I think if we change our lens to start looking at, okay, these behaviors are telling us something, and that means we need to do something and intervene as opposed to being able to shut it down, to ignore it and to punish it and to remove it, really, because we've always seen it as removing it for the safety of everyone else. I also use this visual because while this is a student on the spectrum who is interacting with someone else, you can see all the little thoughts in the head that are happening simultaneously. And while that's happening to someone on the spectrum, and I've witnessed it, it's also what people with anxiety are also thinking and feeling simultaneously to interacting with someone else. So I think this is a really good visual. And because I have a lot of people on here who work in the special ed field, it's also a really good visual to be able to show to some of your teachers who may or may not get it, particularly for some of your inclusion classrooms.
Kara?
Yeah.
We have a quick question. Someone asked for you to just expand and explain a little bit more about chandeliering and what that means.
Yeah. So chandeliering is, when we think of behaviors in a classroom, right? We think, and we've some of you've seen this, right? The flip desk, right? Which is a display of anger, but you have people who literally have kind of just been, I wouldn't say a calm state, right? Weren't necessarily the easiest student, but didn't necessarily give a behavior like that. And then all of a sudden to display that behavior, right? It means they have been pushed to the brink, right, of explosion. And what we would typically do is to remove the student from the environment or students from the environment because we see it as an unsafe moment in time. And on some level, it is. But the difference is to ask yourself, well, if we allowed that person to just sit for a moment and to calm down, however that happens for them, and not necessarily remove them from that one particular place and space. Because what happens when someone chandeliers is we automatically think, oh my God, something's completely wrong and I need to keep everyone safe who's in this room. And what we end up doing is further triggering this person who is literally already hurt and on their brink because their behavior is telling us something else is underlying that. And I'm not saying we have all the answers in schools, right? There's a layer level of referring and getting assistance, but that behavior has always been seen as that's a really bad kid. They have bad behaviors and they get put these labels on it instead of necessarily intervening. And so I don't want to say this isn't chandeliering isn't something that someone repeatedly does on a daily basis, right? It's someone who hadn't been doing anything and then all of a sudden that happened, if that makes sense. But that doesn't change the fact that you have students who also do flip desks every day also, right? But the reality is that that also could be because they don't want to be there and there's some layer and level of anxiety that we haven't attended to. And I think that's also hard, particularly for our nonverbal students, where we just don't know. And so one of the things that we need to start thinking about first is really compassion and empathy first before trying to change behaviors. And so some of you have heard the term neurodiverse before. And really, we don't talk about any one of these things in any of these diagnoses in separation anymore. We do really talk about them neurodiversity. But what we've never really attended to is that mental health, right, is also a part of neurodiversity because it affects the same functions of the brain that also all of these diagnoses include. And I actually like this visual a lot because it also gives you the overlap of the strengths in order to work with some of these students. But we talk about neurodiversity, ADHD, autism, Tourette's, right? Dysgraphia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, like some of our learning disabilities. But mental health is that piece. And so one of the ways in which we have been reluctant to do, although we do have numerous students who are on what I'll call 504s, is we've been really reluctant to also put mental health in an IEP perspective or things of that nature because it just wasn't what we did. But the reality is we're putting IEPs for all these other things, but mental health is a huge component of that also needs its own tailored differentiation. And that's one of the things that we're going to see increase over a period of time in order to intercede on all students' behalf. We're actually going to have to change how we teach to address mental health if we're not coming up with individualized plans for that as well. And to be honest, that'd be almost too hard at this point because it's going to be by the masses. In here, just so you know, is a link to the actual stress in the pandemic and kids' development. And this is really looking at where in the brain this affects. And so we're going to talk about executive functioning. For those of you who are on child study teams, who are working in special ed, you've been talking about executive functioning all these years, and particularly with students who have ADHD. And so I'm going to show you a video that talks about all these things, but I also want you to ask yourself, right? Executive functioning is what they showed also in the, the air traffic control in the ACEs video. It is your ability to be able to think and plan and to do tasks. So it includes planning and prioritizing. I tell people there have been marriages that have been broken up on task initiation. You want your spouse to do something, you have it all laid out, and they literally can't walk across the room to go do it. It's true because there are aspects that affect our brain that affect executive functioning. So we as educators are asking these kids to do all of these things all the time, when in reality, they're impaired and have a hard time being able to do that. And so one of the ways in which I'm going to present some of the solutions is it's not just about embedding social emotional learning in your classroom, right? It's also embedding in certain contents, in all contents, an executive functioning strategy, right? So these are things we used to have to differentiate before for individual students. These are now what we're going to have to do for the masses. And I can't say this for any of you, but during the pandemic myself, and I've been working a lot, I personally have been slower to be able to do tasks. My focus is a lot less, right? And it is an impairment of what's happening as a result of literally the global pandemics that are also happening. And so if it's happening to us, and then and we also have kids, and our kids are also watching this, and it's happening to our kids, we can assume that they are going to have a lot less executive functioning skills and the long break than they would have previously had had we just been off for summer. So I am going to play this video for those of you who are not familiar with executive functioning, because they do a really good job at explaining this.
Executive functions are the mental processes that enable us to plan, focus attention, remember instructions, and juggle multiple tasks successfully. We can distinguish between 3 components: 1. Working memory, 2. Inhibitory control, and 3. Cognitive flexibility. All 3 are interlinked and influence each other. Psychologist Deborah Phillips from Georgetown University calls it the air traffic control system of our brain. Like an air traffic control system has to manage lots of airplanes departing and landing with perfect timing, we have to manage a lot of information and distractions simultaneously. Without good executive functions, disaster strikes. Let's look at the 3 different components. The working memory is responsible for processing information. If well developed, it allows us to manage multiple chunks of information at the same time. Complex tasks can be solved and deep ideas understood. Without much of it, our intelligence is limited. Inhibitory control describes our capability to concentrate, regulates our emotions, and controls our behavior during stressful situations. It's an essential skill if we want to change a childhood habit. Without it, we might have trouble controlling our behavior and can come across as weird. Cognitive flexibility is the ability to adapt to new tasks quickly and to change our perspective. If we have little of it, we can't adapt, get stuck in old thoughts, and have tunnel vision. We come across as stubborn and uncooperative. To demonstrate their roles, let's compare 2 imaginary teenagers, Anne and Jay. Anne is a working memory monster. She can keep lots of ideas in her mind at any given time and mentally buffers digits to calculate them in her head. Even if she gets interrupted or feels a change of emotions, she realizes but is still able to continue what she started. Jay's working memory is tiny. What Anne solves in her head, he has to write down. It's hard for him to read complex sentences or follow a longer train of thought. He gets distracted easily and starts thinking about something else. At school, Anne is an inhibitory control genius. She is fully in charge of her emotions and how they are expressed in her behavior. If a teacher loses his temper, she remains calm and friendly. It's easy for her to focus for long periods of time. As a result, her work is good and the feedback on it is positive. Jay's emotions instantly express themselves in his behavior, which he often fails to control. He can get distracted easily, and hence he has difficulties finishing what he started. His work remains mediocre. This can lead to negative feedback and a lower self-esteem. Anne's cognitive flexibility is great. She can change her perspective and find ways around roadblocks. At school, she adjusts from one subject to another at the speed of light. Jay has difficulty solving problems because his thinking is inflexible. To change his perspective in response to constructive criticism takes a lot of his mental energy. Even simple tasks like switching from talking to listening is hard for him. Others can find this annoying. Executive function develops mainly during the first 5 years of our lives. A caring, playful, and nourishing childhood is our best bet to increase them. Free play trains our inhibitory control, and games practice our working memory. Playing an instrument trains our brain to process the notes and to coordinate the right and left hand simultaneously. If others are listening, we learn to control our emotions. Movement is great as well. In football, each situation is new. Ball possession requires quick decisions and builds cognitive flexibility. One study showed that kids that walked barefoot each day for just 16 minutes improved their working memory, because when they do, they need to keep many things in mind. With a lot of practice as kids, we become real executives of our own mind. This then allows us to excel in teams and help solve some of the world's more complex problems. And since we are able to focus on them for a long period and don't give up easily, success is just a matter of time. Those of you who have some executive function can now maximize their learning from this video. Just turn off YouTube, take out pen and paper, and summarize the concept in your own simple language. If you fail this time, try again and then do it. Executive function.
So I do want to point out that executive functioning was something that we used to really only attend to and say that students with certain learning disabilities or students who had ADHD and had some gaps, we would talk about specific tasks of executive functioning. And we do know, and to speak to that question of our 3 to 5 year olds, that it does really start to form and crystallize fairly early on. The reality is it's not something that we have attended to for years, and we can't assume anymore that kids have this. And when students are having any layer and level of mental health or any neurological component happening, we tend to have gaps in executive functioning. And executive functioning is one of those things that we are now all tasked with intervening. And I go back to, this isn't about individual students, IEPs or 504s. This is what all students are going to need. And even us as adults right now, as a result of what we're experiencing globally and what's happening in the world right now. And so even us as adults are limited in some of our executive functioning skills, or it takes longer, or we're noticing different things. And so there is an assumption to be made that our students are going to need this even more than they've ever needed that. And so I'm going to go through in our last 30 minutes-ish.
Tara?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted a question came in and it does pertain to the video, so I figured it would make more sense if I asked it now. So someone is asking, and then they give an example. So they're asking, can constant negative reinforcement impact cognitive flexibility? For example, and it said, for example, if you put the girl, and I'm thinking the girl in the video, if you put the girl in a situation where she is put down no matter what she does, would her cognitive flexibility weaken?
Yes, absolutely. And also that simultaneously, it's not just decreasing cognitive flexibility, it's also increasing internalizing and lowering self-esteem. And so by not having the motivation, the self-esteem, and the self-concept to even come back to continue trying is also going to be the rationale for why that cognitive flexibility. So negative reinforcement all the time, and I'll say this, and I will say this as a mom of a parent of a child on the spectrum who also used ABA early on, which was a game changer for us. But for us, we almost did it too long, the more compliant he became, because my child in school in a fully functioning and inclusive setting automatically says, I'm sorry when he's redirected, because he has been conditioned to be redirected based on his behavior to fit what everybody else wanted. And so he automatically feels that he's in fault and internalizes that all the time. And so I say that's almost identical to what you're saying. If we're negative reinforcing all the time, then we are also constantly giving people a low self-concept and really not giving themselves what I'll say, empowering them to want to take risks to increase that cognitive flexibility. I put this in the PowerPoint, not necessarily to go over, but it's another aspect for me that talks about some of the strengths that we see that we can start to move forward when we work with some of our students neurodiversity, which again also includes mental health. We already talked about all behavior is really communication. And we need to look at that behavior as a communication to really what's happening inside our brain, and to really reframe it for kids. And all of you are here, right? And so it's not that your whole school community is here or your administration be here, but my hope is that you are a little armed with a little more information that you might be able to advocate for what you're able to control in your spheres of influence. So the question is, what's your role? And I am going to speed through this, but also tell you what's here for you to understand some more information. This is really to talk about what remote learning should be and what it's not. And I want to say this, I actually witnessed students get thrown out of Zoom classrooms. Can you imagine the trauma associated with getting thrown out of a Zoom classroom because the teacher was freaking out herself and couldn't figure out how to control things? And, you know, we are in a space where you can mute people, right? Or do lots of other things, but to throw people out of a remote learning setting really, and someone who was already classified with special ed, really triggered for me. It happened 3 times that I was able to witness and hear from people's experiences. So this is just a reminder of what remote learning is not in the event that we end up in remote learning. So I've been working nationally with a couple of colleagues, and this model that you see right now was about school counseling. But I'm showing it to you because I think it is important for you to recognize that these are things that we now have to attend to in schools. So there is going to be a pandemic response, and I'll talk about a couple of those things that they'll need. There is a mental health component, and you'll hear everyone talk about trauma-informed practices and SEL, and I'll talk about the caution with that. Talking about race, and all of you are going to actually now have to be really comfortable about talking about race in light of everything that's going on, and then the economic impact that it's having for people. And so I also recognize as teachers that you can be advocates and be part of our systems of support. And so if you look at the center of all of this, it's relationships. And so our main focus going back for at least 2 weeks is literally on relationships. Relationships with teachers, relationships with students, relationships with communities, and relationships within and to the school in and of itself. Because those relationships are going to look a lot different. And what students need, no matter what happens right now, is to be heard, valued, and seen. They don't need a bunch of algebra being thrown at them, right? They need to know that they're safe, that they are cared for, and that they are open to the possibility of really using and working on executive functioning and social emotional skills and academic content. So I myself have gone to numerous webinars since this time period has also happened. And one of the things that they explain this in order is that students really do need to feel physically and emotionally safe, and we'll talk about how to do that, and then connect and feel like belonging. We know all the research from college all the way down to preschool. If students feel that they belong or even have a relationship with one person, they're less likely to drop out, right? Same concept here. So we need them to be safe. We need to feel like they have an actual place of belonging, particularly in school and in a classroom. And there are lots of students for years who don't feel comfortable in schools. And so we have to really rethink about what that looks like. We need to offer social and emotional support and triage before we even get to this academic piece. So we need to look at this as the roadmap, right? Kind of in a backwards way on this sheet, on this slide. I've already talked about relationships and routines, and so I'm going to go into specifics of what that looks like. So overall, in the broad sense, here is your role. That you need to attend, obviously, to your self-care and to be really reflective for yourself and really attend to your own physical and mental health. A lot of you had certain coping skills and the pandemic hit and you had to create different coping skills. What we don't know is if students adjusted to what those different coping skills are, or did they just have their coping skills removed? We also need to bracket our personal views. This isn't a political statement, but if you're not someone who's comfortable to talk about race and you work in schools, that's a really hard thing for yourself moving forward. So what I'm saying is to really educate yourself in this process, even if you're doing it on your own and not conjunction with others, because that door is open and that door is coming, and it also contributes to trauma and mental health. And then they're going to need pre-communication outreach from you. I'm specifically going to talk about what they need from you before school starts, and then how to build strength-based classrooms that are also neurodiverse inclusive. And so doing that is kind of providing an emotional safe classroom, building those connections and relationships. You think I say relationships more than once. Teach and empower social connection and social skills. You know, this isn't just certain kids who need social skills anymore. This is everyone, right? And social emotional learning. To use strength-based communication and visual support, which can be new for some teachers, and then obviously implement the social emotional learning. So when we talk about trauma-informed practices, they're all of these. And I want to be clear that each one of these little cones off of all of this is its own PD. I right now have already talked about ACEs, right? I'm going to talk a little bit about social emotional learning, and I'm going to talk about a layer of universal screening and restorative practice, right? Like 1 to 2 sentences. So I want to be clear, all of these things matter, but they're each their own PDs in and of itself. I want to talk about restorative practices. It's a term you started to hear more and more. I say this because punishment and discipline needs to look different right now to attend to everyone's mental health. And so for those of you who don't know what restorative practice are, it's really also giving students a voice and processing what their behavior looked like and what might have occurred to get there and how that can change in the future. And I know that seems kind of, I don't know, fuzzy for feely, touchy-feely for people, but this really is about educating students about their behavior and showing care and concern as opposed to discipline. And I'm just going to leave that there because that's not all of it, all in your hands, right? You're not all in charge of discipline, but you are in charge of what happens in your classroom. And those are the ways in which you can change your conversations and narratives. Pre-communication, I put that this will be an adjustment. There's a hyperlink here to what has come out from school psychologists and school counselors as far as reentry, but there's a hyperlink here to a video. And I say this because if you are going to be in school and school is going to look different, and particularly for those of you in early childhood, you need videos of what it looks like, where people are going to sit, and you need to use your actual school to be able to do that. In order to take in executive functioning skills, it's easier right now for everyone to have some sort of a visual. And so we've been doing this for long periods of time, particularly for students with other neurological disorders, to kind of pre-plan or visual schedules. Those things matter more than ever, and not just at the early childhood, they matter at the high school level as well. And so the more visuals you can use in pre-prepping people, the better. That also means if we're going to be fully remote too, and there's a component, you're going to want to do videos for students on how to, and teachers, and then also have those in different languages. So if that didn't happen previously, you also want to do that now. That also means you yourself doing a video as the person's teacher kind of coming in. This is something that I use with school counselors, but I want to attend to a couple things. I already talked about the how-to videos in the event that we're home. But if you are using Google Classroom and you are using a Google Voice, right, and or checking emails, you want to be very explicit up front about here's the times I'm available to answer email, here's the number, and you should have a directory in your schools of all those things for parents in the event that we're staying kind of remote. The other piece is that we are going to need to figure out how to increase what I call brain breaks and teach students how to take breaks mentally and emotionally, which is really hard, was easier to do in a classroom, but we never really did it before. And now we may have to figure out how to translate that and what that looks like virtually. And so I just kind of wanted to put that on there. And then I wrote this for administrators, but you also are going to want consents and waivers in the event we're in school full time in your student handbooks, so that if we have to go to remote at any point in time, all of that is already done for you based on what's happened this particular year. Also, the CDC has a distinction between wash, sanitizing, and disinfecting, particularly for my early childhood people. And so basically they say to wash everything. The moment you get into sanitizing and disinfecting, you're also getting into potentially, if it goes into people's mouth, being harmful. So I'm just putting that out there. Here is a hyperlink to 101 ways in which to teach social skills. Because again, this is the longest time that people haven't interacted with one another. They don't know how to operate anymore within school setting, both virtually now and in person. And so a lot of time teachers are going to have to start really incorporating how to teach social skills, as opposed to we used to do this in small groups and other aspects. It actually needs to be part of a classroom to really relearn that piece, and while they're building relationships with the other students in class. I put this here because one of the aspects here is of trauma-informed practices, culturally responsive education. And everyone is at a different place in space, and part of that is educating yourself and or your school then educating you. And so I'm just putting this there that it really matters in the whole system of support for students, as opposed to, you know, all one hits of some of these things. For those of you who haven't seen, we're asking to start talking really early about race and to look at your libraries and to assess your curriculum and to see where that fits in there. And everyone this is really to dismantle that they're not too young to talk about race. And so this is a chart that really talks about as young as they are, what they notice, what they can handle. And I say this because a lot of you in here are early childhood and or elementary. And these are other ways to be able to support your students of color. And so I put them here just again to highlight and to make sure I share this with you. And then I want to take time to focus on these things. So here is what I personally have created in my mind as what works in classrooms. And so the first and foremost piece of this is really how to build rapport and to use strength-based communication with students. It matters. And really, teachers aren't trained in what I call counseling skills, but every teacher at this point in time needs a layer and level of immediate counseling skills, which I'll talk about. Visual support used to be only for certain people. It now needs to be for everybody, because when you're overwhelmed, you can't really intake the information that you're reading. You do need a visual prompt. And again, I want to highlight to my high school people, this also means high school. It also means higher ed. It doesn't just mean that we're doing this for our elementary and early childhood. You are the masters of your own content, so I don't pretend to touch any of that. But what I can say is that we really can't teach academically anymore. Well, first, not until we've set up really rapport and structure and routines and trust and relationships, because students aren't going to take in the information anymore without that. But we also need to start including as social emotional learning objectives and executive functioning empowerment. And keeping in mind, we can't diagnose for, you don't diagnose for mental health, you don't diagnose executive functioning as a disorder either, but there are components of each of those skill sets that are already embedded and can be embedded and explicitly pointed out for students while they are learning, right? So it's not just that I'm learning math, I'm also learning maybe a little more self-awareness and also how to increase my working memory simultaneously. And the more explicit we are with objectives about those embedded in lessons, the more we're able to reach student potential success. And I recognize my 10 minutes, so
Okay.
I know this.
I was just about to say.
I know where I am.
Okay.
Emotionally safe classroom really begins with you, and it really begins with understanding and recognizing hidden messages. And I think that that's what we haven't realized over time, is that students say things and students hear them and they hear an underlying message, and you don't realize that they're hearing underlying messages. And so we're going to, in order to create that community, there's lots of things that have to happen. This is my plug here, that every classroom, not like one space anymore, needs a brain break space. And I don't like calm down corners, although a lot of you have it, but the rationale is something's wrong with you, you need to be calmed, as opposed to my brain really does need a break, my body has signified that I need a break. And so you'll actually now find these on the Google emoji classrooms in remote learning too, where we put links to meditation and music and our puzzles, some sensory things that help students calm down. And this is, again, not just for elementary and early childhood. This is also for high school children. And so we need to start making this more of a process to be able to infuse in our classrooms and in your specific classrooms. And so that it's not uncommon to really believe I have a system in place to how that works. And I've seen this done really well in certain elementary schools and in some middle schools, but it really would behoove some of us to also have it in high school as well. So these are the emotional needs of students. I put them here because here is what they need to know, that they belong, they have control, and someone's really empowering and encouraging them. And here are some of the feelings and emotional aspects that we can name for them that we've never really explicitly. And that's the point. Everything needs to be explicitly spelled out. So in the folder, in the link that you're going to get, there is a folder about really recognizing feelings. Because one of the things that we do in counseling is to automatically, no matter what someone says, validate a feeling, right? And so I have specific examples for you to be able to practice to recognize those feelings. Because the first thing you want to do when you're encountering and redirecting someone is really to validate what that feeling is. If I feel like you are validating me, I might trust you a little more. And now I'm open to what you have to say because you understand what's happening to me. And so, obviously, in the amount of time, we're not going to go through all these examples, but I do have practice exercises for you to be able to engage so that if you have questions, you can work through that. The other piece is there's also a whole sheet dedicated to this too, with specific examples for you to follow, is, they say something, the student, you say something, and here's what they hear, and then this is what they feel. So what you say to that child really matters, particularly if you're redirecting. So just to give you this example, it says, I can't stand school or anything. And you say, oh, everyone's felt that way. You'll get over it. And you've heard people say this. You probably have said it yourself, right? But here's what they hear. My feelings aren't valid or real. My judgment about school is poor, and that, you're not the problem, right? Or you are the problem. So they feel rejected, put down, pushed aside. And so then that shuts them down from wanting to be able to do anything else. And so there are examples also in the folder you get of how to practice what they're hearing and what they're feeling, and then what you might want to say in response to that. And part of that really is about communication. I do want to talk about using written language. If we are going to be face-to-face, one of the really good tools about doing this is writing something on a Post-it note to an individual kid. And the reason we say that is, I could say to a kid, hey, do you mind lowering your voice? Or I can go up to the kid, not single them out, and have them write it down. And when they're reading it from that piece of paper or a visual, right, they're actually translating it and saying it to themselves. So it removes you out of the situation, right? And it's the person receiving that information. So if we start redirecting how we use communication with students, then we're also gaining another layer and level of trust. I'm gonna talk about visuals real quick. I know where I am as time. I got you. All right, here are 9 reasons to use visuals. They're permanent. They allow time for language processing. A lot of you in special ed already use first and then, so you understand that concept. Visuals help see kids, help see what you mean, because sometimes we assume by the language that they understand, but it doesn't necessarily mean that. It's an overall help, because at the end of the day, no matter what it does, it takes an emotional piece out of it, and it helps reduce anxiety. And that's what we really need to do right now for all students. So I do want to attend to the organizational systems. So really in class, you should have an organizational system. But what's going to be very beneficial and helpful right now, and this is for you to advocate in your schools, is if you're on Google Classrooms, then everyone's classroom is set up in the same way. And the rationale for that is, if I'm having trouble executive functioning and I can't figure out, I need to know that all the work is here. Here's what happens when we complete it. And if we're changing it into all these classes, it becomes overwhelming if we're going to be fully remote. So one of the things for schools to do is to obviously use the same platform, but try and have a shell of what classrooms look like and how and where things go, and then obviously have a video to practice that, because the organization for your students in school was already hard. And then to do it on the computer, it doesn't necessarily translate in the same way. And so to be very clear about the system of organization that you have in that remote learning setting. Obviously, the content is all you, which leads us to SEL. SEL is really about, our state has adopted it. Some of you are in SEL fully implemented schools, and some of you are not. But the reality is it improves academics, behaviors, and fewer negative behaviors. What I do want to say to you is that there's a caution to this, because SEL is very prescriptive about what we want students to have. And so we could also police. So that's just my take on letting you know about social emotional learning. So it really is the process by which students understand, manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, which we do know reduces cortisol and combats bullying, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. So CASEL, if those of you aren't familiar, has these 5 categories of social emotional learning that the state of New Jersey adopted. The difference is the state of New Jersey adopted it, said to principals, here, go educate your staff. So not everybody is there, and then the pandemic hit. And so what you're going to start to hear from other people is that, are we doing universal screeners? And so what this means is, instead of benchmarking just math and or reading, we now have schools who are going to built in SEL screeners. And so what that means is we're going to also benchmark how they're doing in social emotional learning. All 4 of these are hyperlinks for you to learn a lot more about social emotional learning, and really what that could look like in remote learning as well. And I have literally outlined in depth what these 5 these areas are. And for those of you who are not familiar, this is New Jersey's, how New Jersey has made it its competencies. So you can also display these in your classroom. I'm speeding through, well, not speeding, they're all here in individual slides so you understand what they are, including sample questions. So here's the thing, no one's asking anyone to change the content that you teach. We're asking that you spend 2 weeks building relationships with each other and trusting relationships with everyone in the classroom in order to have learning occur. But social emotional learning can be added to each lesson that you're actually working on. And here are sample questions that you can embed to meet some of these goals. And no one's saying you're building them all at the same time. So we should have a content objective, and through that content objective, we can build one social emotional learning skill and maybe one executive piece. And so before I end this, I'm gonna show you what it looks like all together. So obviously this is an in-person lesson, and this is a math and bar graphing. And so it's an assignment where they're also working on teams, right? And some of you have seen this in like camps, right? They actually have to work together to build the Cheerios, and they're kind of in a race with other teams, but eventually they're gonna bar it from a math content perspective. But it's also working on fine motor skills. It's working on team building, which is an SEL component. It's also working on planning, which is an executive functioning skill. It's also working on relationship skills from a group perspective, which is social emotional learning, right? Organizing as far as patterns are concerned, task initiation, right? Self-regulation, because we're also going to talk about what happens when we lose, because we can add that to that component. And then we can also graph this. So again, it could be something physical that we would have had done to have them do math and graph, but we're also building all these things. But what we're also doing is explicitly saying to our students, here's what we're also doing in the same breath. So we're prioritizing the academic piece, but we're also prioritizing these other skills that are really important and for you to be successful in life. And so the more students see this, right? And they're more willing to do the academic content and learn at the same time because they know they're also getting these skills. And that's a very different way of approaching how to handle education than we've done in the past. But really, this is also reducing anxiety and attending to the mental health and neurodiversity in general in all of our classes. And then the last thing I'll say as we hit 1201 is that some schools have, and this is Glassboro itself, but some schools have gone whole school initiative. And so they are using the exact same language for everything that they do in all of the classrooms. And this is what is up in every classroom. So everybody knows that this is what we do, right? If we need a brain break, we're pausing and taking deep breaths, and they practice that and build it in so that this is part of the structure and the process as far as whole school social emotional learning implementation is. So I just want you to know that this is here for you to be able to go work through. And every week, everyone gets the same story. And they really are promoting empathy and how to think through what this means, right? And so there are if some schools were doing this, this is what we would call one-hit wonder. But if you're doing a whole school rollout, it is the whole school, it's the same language, just like PBIS, and then there's also what it looks like in the classroom, and then what it looks like in classroom lessons. And so schools are at varying ways across this continuum, but everyone has to start somewhere. And in relation to the pandemics, we all need to take kind of a stride on that. And then one of the things I ask schools to do is to put on all their doors, if we're physically here, this is a safe space, and letting students know that you support all of them in their social emotional development by something. And so that it's visual, it's something that they see every day, and they know that everyone in that room cares for them. And yes, I'm ending. Sorry. And this is a QR code and a link to the survey, right?
Yes, and the survey should automatically show up as people are leaving the meeting. And we just ask that everybody complete that, give us the feedback so that we know how to direct ourselves with different webinars and different trainings that we're offering into the future. And,
I am willing to answer some questions.
Yes, and I was going to say to you, there are 2 questions in the Q&A now, but before that, I just wanted to give you a very warm thank you, because I know how hard you work and how hard you've been working over the past few months in addition to all the work you normally do. So thank you very much for all of this and sharing this with everybody.
And I also know it's overwhelming.
But we still appreciate you taking it and kind of really helping everybody understand things more. So there's two questions right now. One is, I am teaching virtual ESY this year, and I want to offer resources to parents without overwhelming them. What are your suggestions for approaching parents with this information and meeting student needs remotely?
So this is very interesting because I've been working with school districts who've been planning for ESY. So I personally, and this is like what I would do because I'm a touchy-feely person, I actually would have built an emoji classroom and had different links to resources. And one of the reasons I like that is because it's visual and parents get to click on things on where to go. So if you're looking for different resources, the question is, I'm talking about how to present it, right? As opposed to what those resources are, because you all know this, right? All of a sudden we have all of these information about racism, right? And or the pandemic or remote teaching, and it all comes at you. And so being able to chunk down 3 or 4 things per a topic area is what you want. So if you want just communication, maybe you have a section of how to communicate, with your students, or, how to refer them for certain aspects. But whatever you do, you want to condense and make sure you don't give it 3 to 5 things per subcategory. And another way to really be able to do that is to use Padlet. If those of you aren't familiar, basically it's like a bulletin board, like an old school bulletin board that you can also put things on that you can hyperlink to, that also is just this one place and space that they can go to. And so this isn't about, your question might actually be about the specific resources. I'm talking about how you want to present it to them so they're getting overwhelmed, because parents will also say the same thing. There's so much information coming at me all the time, but if they need something, they at least have this one place and space to go that's highly organized, I guess I should say. Because I'm going to be honest, I'm overwhelmed as a parent and I don't take in half of what I get.
Okay. The second question is a whole classroom break okay too if you don't have a separate break space for the students? Yes,
but absolutely. In fact, I would say a lot of our elementary schools actually who implement whole school SEL do this. It's kind of the same way like when we do the bathroom, right? Like everyone takes a break together and we work through it. So a lot of what you'll see during those time periods is a systemic way in which we do this. So it might be that we do a meditation or mindfulness, which a lot of classrooms do to break that space. But what we also need to normalize is that it's not the same for everyone. And so while it's quiet, that they're allowed during that time to get something that's sensory or whatever else you want to build into that, but definitely whole class breaks work. And if you are in remote learning, providing that, I can tell you that my kids' classroom did 3 times a week, like a video of mindfulness every week also. So there's a way to be able to engage those breaks online as well if we don't happen to be in the classroom. But yeah, definitely. But what I would also say then is there are going to be certain kids that are going to need it at other times and consistently feel overwhelmed. And so we also might want to have an alternative plan, if you have to have that. But if you're doing whole class, you might not need it.
Okay, great. We don't have any other questions right now in the queue. Oh, hold on. How frequent would you recommend a whole class break?
Wow. So I would say at least 1 to 2. Well, how you start the morning and easing in can maybe cause for only 1 before the lunch break. But sometimes in the afternoon, you might need 2. Even if they're 5 to 10 minutes, right? It's 5 minutes is kind of the norm for allowing students even just individually to go in brain break spaces. But it matters. Think about us. We need it. So if our attention spans are so large, are supposed to be larger, like they need it a lot more. So 2 on either side of the day works, but I can see only really needing 1 in the morning, but maybe having a couple more in the afternoon.
Okay, awesome. And I'm sure right now you probably need a break after speed talking and getting through all this information. We don't have any more questions. If anybody has any other questions for Kara, if you want to pop them into the Q&A right now, that would be great. But otherwise, thank you so much for everything. And We will be sharing out the video, and the links were in the chat, but we'll also send an email out with the links so that everybody can access the materials that you put together.
Awesome. And thanks for everyone putting on those links and phone numbers while it was going on too.
Yes, that was Judy and Emily from LRC-South, so thank you both. And all right, so there's no more questions in the Q&A, so I think that that we're good. Thank you so much, Kara.
No problem. Thank you for everyone for being here. Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.